And I don't think he'll change. He is committed of his own level of service, and that will remain.
She walked out. No warning, no explanation, just silence, and the sound of a door closing behind her. Princess Anne has survived decades of royal storms without flinching, but this time, something broke through that iron composure, and the woman who caused it was Camilla. Behind closed palace doors, Queen Elizabeth's most private possessions, garments she never intended the world to see, were allegedly handed to the one person Anne believes should never have been allowed anywhere near them. And nothing inside those walls will ever quite look the same again.
In many respects, need to deal with it. Mm-hmm. Not least of all because it is the monarch that is the key to this, and the Constitution.
There is a room beneath Buckingham Palace that most people will never see. It is temperature controlled, carefully lit, and lined with garments that together tell the story of a reign that lasted 70 years. Dresses, coats, hats, gloves, and accessories, approximately 4,000 pieces in total, make up what royal historians and curators now describe as one of the most important surviving fashion archives of the 20th century. Every item was worn by Queen Elizabeth II. Every item was catalogued, preserved, and stored with the same level of care you might expect for a state document or a crown jewel. Because in the world of the British monarchy, that is exactly what they are. The late Queen was famously involved in her own wardrobe. She was not simply handed outfits and told what to wear. She worked closely with a small team of trusted designers and dressmakers, many of whom spent decades at Buckingham Palace. Norman Hartnell, who designed both her wedding dress in 1947 and her coronation gown in 1953, was the most prominent of these. Angela Kelly, who served as the Queen's personal assistant and senior dresser for years, kept meticulous records of every piece: the fabric used, the occasion it was worn, the precise placement of every brooch and every pin. These were not fashion notes. They were a living record of a public life conducted entirely in service to the crown. This archive is not just a collection of old clothes. It is, as one designer connected to the Royal Collection Trust put it, a time capsule, a snapshot of a very long life, a life of duty. And it is precisely because of that weight, that sense of history and meaning, that what allegedly happened in the early weeks of 2026 inside the palace caused the kind of quiet earthquake that senior royals almost never allow to become visible from the outside. The story begins with an exhibition. In April 2026, Buckingham Palace opened the doors to what was billed as the largest and most comprehensive display of Queen Elizabeth II's fashion ever assembled. Titled Queen Elizabeth II, Her Life in Style, the exhibition at the King's Gallery featured around 200 items, roughly half of which had never been publicly displayed before. The Queen would have turned 100 years old that April, and the exhibition was conceived as a centenary celebration of her style and her legacy. Visitors could see her coronation gown, her wedding dress, childhood pieces from as early as 1934, and, for the first time, items from her private off-duty wardrobe: riding jackets, Harris tweed, headscarves, raincoats, the things she wore when the cameras were not pointed at her. Preparation for this exhibition had been underway for months. Curators from the Royal Collection Trust worked carefully with palace staff to select, restore, and arrange the pieces. It was, by all accounts, a significant undertaking. And it was during this period of preparation, during the access, the cataloging, the quiet movement of garments in and out of storage, that something reportedly happened which Princess Anne did not know about until someone told her by accident. According to accounts that later circulated among royal insiders, Queen Camilla's office made arrangements for Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, to be given a private viewing of certain pieces from the Queen's personal archive, not the exhibition, pieces already selected for public display. The private archive, the pieces that existed beyond the official record, the off-duty items, the deeply personal garments that the late Queen had never intended for public consumption in the first place. The context for this decision, at least as Camilla's office would later frame it, was the ongoing and deeply sensitive question of Sussex reconciliation. King Charles had met privately with his son Prince Harry in September 2025, the first time the two had seen each other in well over a year. There was cautious movement towards some form of peace. Royal watchers had noted Charles's apparent desire to maintain a connection with his grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet. And there were quiet signals from the palace that the door, while not open, was at least no longer bolted shut. Against this backdrop, a gesture toward Meghan, an invitation into something private and meaningful connected to Queen Elizabeth, might have been intended as a bridge, a way of saying, without saying it directly, that the past could eventually be moved on from. Whether King Charles personally authorized this gesture, or whether it was arranged independently by those within Camilla's office, is a question that does not appear to have a clear, confirmed answer. What does appear clear, based on what insiders have described, is that Princess Anne was not consulted. She was not informed in advance, and she did not find out through any official channel. This matters enormously when you understand who Princess Anne is and what her relationship to her mother's legacy actually looks like in practice. Princess Anne is the only daughter of Queen Elizabeth II. She has, by virtually every measure, given more of herself to royal duty than almost any other member of the working family. She carries out more public engagements year after year than most of her relatives, and she has done so consistently, without complaint, without public grievance, and without ever using her position to attract personal attention. She once advised Meghan Markle, when Meghan was newly married into the family and apparently seeking guidance from senior royals, that being royal was not a path to fame. It was a job. You showed up on time, you did your research, you carried out the duty, and then you went home. Meghan, according to royal commentators who later spoke about this meeting, left somewhat dumbfounded by the directness of this advice. The two women never particularly warmed to each other after that. Anne's feelings about the Sussexes more broadly have not been hidden, at least not from those who know how to read the signals. She has been described by insiders as someone who believes it is, in her own words, madness that King Charles would consider any form of reconciliation or forgiveness toward Meghan in particular. She has allegedly aligned herself with Prince William on this point, and Anne is not someone who involves herself in family politics unless she feels strongly enough about something to break from her usual habit of staying out of it. When she does speak, those close to her say, it carries weight. So, when word reached her, reportedly through a junior member of staff who mentioned it in passing, not realizing Anne had not been told, that Meghan had been granted access to the late Queen's private archive of personal clothing, the reaction was not immediate and explosive. It rarely is with Anne. Instead, something colder and more deliberate set in, a kind of focused, calculating attention that people who know her well describe as far more serious than any outburst could ever be. She began quietly to ask questions. Who had authorized the access? Which pieces had been included? Who had accompanied Meghan during the viewing? Has the Royal Collection Trust been formally notified? These were not aggressive questions. They were administrative questions, the kind that a woman with decades of experience navigating palace bureaucracy knows how to ask in a way that does not immediately signal what she already suspects. Because what Anne suspected, and what she was already beginning to piece together before anyone else in the palace had fully registered that there was a problem, was that the decision had been made not as a genuine act of generosity toward the crown's legacy, but as a political move, a piece of soft power quietly deployed by Camilla's office, designed to smooth the path for a reconciliation that Anne believed served no one's interests except those who stood to benefit from appearing gracious. The Queen's wardrobe to Anne was not a diplomatic resource. It was not a gift to be offered. It was a responsibility. And in the days that followed, as she gathered more information and the picture became clearer, her jaw tightened, her schedule carried on as always, and she said almost nothing to anyone, which, to those who knew her, was the clearest possible sign that something was coming. Princess Anne has never been a woman who reacts. She responds. And the distinction matters because it explains almost everything about how she operates within an institution that runs on appearances, protocol, and the management of information. While others in the royal family have, over the years, allowed emotion to push them into public statements, interviews, or gestures that they later had to walk back, Anne has consistently done the opposite. She processes, she observes, she waits until she knows exactly what she is dealing with before she decides what to do about it. This is not coldness, though it can look that way from the outside. It is discipline. The same discipline she has applied to every aspect of her royal life for more than 5 decades. The same discipline she tried unsuccessfully to pass on to Meghan Markle during that early conversation about what it actually means to be a working member of the British royal family. Royalty, Anne told her, is not a platform. It is a job. And a job requires showing up, doing the work, and not expecting applause for it. Meghan, by most accounts, found this advice more bewildering than useful. Anne, by most accounts, was not surprised. In the days after she learned about the private archive access, Anne returned to exactly that discipline. Her public schedule continued without interruption. She attended engagements. She fulfilled her obligations. She gave no indication to the outside world that anything had shifted. But inside the palace, among the small and tightly loyal circle of staff who have served her for years, there was a change in atmosphere. Questions were being asked, records were being checked, and the questions were becoming more specific. What Anne was doing, in effect, was building a picture, not from rumor or feeling, but from the kind of dry administrative evidence that palace life generates in abundance, and that most people never think to look at: scheduling records, access, logs, internal correspondence between offices. The mundane paper trail of an institution that documents almost everything, precisely because it has learned over centuries that documentation is protection. Anne understood this. She also understood that if Camilla's office had arranged something it should not have arranged, the evidence would be there. It would not be dramatic. It would not be a smoking gun in the way that thriller writers imagine these things. It would be a series of small, unremarkable entries that only made sense when you laid them out in the right order and knew what you were looking at. And what she found, when that picture came together, was more troubling than she had initially expected. The access that had been arranged for Meghan was not, as it turned out, a casual or informally organized thing. It had been coordinated. Staff within Camilla's office had been involved in the arrangements. The Royal Collection Trust had been notified only partially, and in terms that did not fully convey the nature of what was being proposed. Certain pieces from the private section of the archive, items that sat outside the curatorial selection for the public exhibition, had been made accessible in a way that bypassed the usual channels through which senior royals would ordinarily request such access. There was no formal request. There was no committee sign-off. There was instead a quiet arrangement made between offices that had the appearance of something routine while being anything but. For Anne, this landed on a very specific nerve. The late Queen's personal wardrobe was not equivalent to the crown jewels, which are managed under strict and well-established legal frameworks. But it was not simply a rack of old dresses either. The private pieces, the off-duty clothing, the personal items that Elizabeth II wore when she was not performing a public role, carried a different kind of significance. They were intimate. They were chosen by a woman who was intensely private about the parts of her life that existed away from the cameras. To grant access to those pieces to someone who had spent years publicly describing her experience inside the royal family, in terms that many of its members considered deeply damaging, felt to Anne like a violation of something that should have been protected. The Duchess of Sussex's relationship with the royal family's heritage had always been a complicated subject. When it came to jewelry from the royal collection, royal commentators had been clear that there was a hierarchy in place. Camilla, as queen, had first access to the late monarch's personal collection. After her came the Princess of Wales. The Duchess of Sussex, as one royal expert had put it plainly, was much further down the pecking order. This was not a personal judgment. It was a matter of constitutional and institutional structure. It reflected the working roles that members of the family held, or in Meghan's case, no longer held. Meghan and Harry had stepped away from their positions as working royals in 2020. They had relocated to California. In the years that followed, they had given an interview to Oprah Winfrey that shook the institution to its foundations, released a documentary series on Netflix that aired significant grievances about the royal family, and Harry had published a memoir that contained allegations about multiple family members, including Camilla herself. Harry had written that he had complex feelings about his father marrying Camilla, had accused her of leaking stories to the press, and had described her as someone who sacrificed him on her personal PR altar. These were not minor complaints. They were public, on the record, and they had caused real and lasting damage to relationships inside the family. Against this backdrop, Anne found it almost impossible to understand how access to the most personal section of her mother's archive could be considered appropriate. It was not the gesture itself that disturbed her most, though the gesture was bad enough. It was what it represented. It was the logic behind it. The idea that the late Queen's belongings, the private ones, the ones that existed outside the public record, could be deployed as a tool of political softening, as a way of making Meghan feel welcomed back into a family whose foundations she had, in Anne's view, done considerable damage to. Princess Anne had said very little on the record about the Sussexes. That was by design. She was not someone who aired grievances publicly, and she was not about to start. But those close to her had, over time, allowed certain things to become known. She thought the idea of reconciliation was misguided. She thought Charles's affection for Harry made him vulnerable to decisions that served Harry and Meghan's interests more than they served the monarchy's. She thought the palace was being too soft, too accommodating, and too willing to treat the Sussexes' return as something to be managed around, rather than something to be evaluated on its actual merits. And now, sitting with a file of administrative records and access logs that told a clear story, she felt something else that she rarely allowed herself to feel. She felt, plainly and simply, that her mother was owed better than this. Queen Elizabeth II had spent 70 years conducting herself with an almost superhuman consistency. She had never complained publicly. She had never given an interview that served her own interests at the expense of the institution. She had never used her personal feelings about anyone, and she had personal feelings, like anyone, to justify a deviation from what the role required. She had shown up, done the work, and trusted that the people around her understood the difference between what was personal and what belonged to the crown. Her wardrobe, and particularly the private pieces of it, sat exactly at that intersection. They were personal, they were hers. And it was the job of those who came after her to protect them with the same care she would have brought to every other decision about how the monarchy presented itself to the world. Anne folded the records. She placed them carefully into a folder. She did not make a call to her brother. She did not send a message to Camilla's office. She did not, as some in her position might have done, begin laying the groundwork for a leak to a trusted journalist. What she did instead was think, carefully, methodically, about what she knew, what she could prove, and what she was prepared to do about it. Because Anne had learned something over 50 years of royal life that many people in positions of power never quite grasp. The most effective moves are rarely the loudest ones. The ones that last, the ones that actually change something, are the ones that are made quietly, at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right preparation behind them. She was not ready yet, but she was getting there. And when she was, there would be no question in anyone's mind, least of all Camilla's, about where she stood and what she was willing to defend. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when Princess Anne has decided that a conversation is going to happen, whether the other person is ready for it or not. Those who have witnessed it describe it less as an absence of sound and more as a presence, a weight in the air that makes everyone around her acutely aware that something is about to shift. It is not threatening in any obvious way. She does not raise her voice. She does not use her title as a weapon or position herself physically to intimidate. She simply arrives with that particular quality of absolute certainty that comes from knowing exactly what you are about to say, and having spent a long time making sure you have every reason in the world to say it. The meeting between Princess Anne and Queen Camilla, by all accounts, was not announced on any official schedule. It did not appear in the coordinated diary shared between royal offices. It was requested quietly, framed as a brief and informal discussion, the kind that senior royals occasionally have with one another outside of formal settings when they prefer not to generate paperwork around a conversation. Camilla, it is said, agreed without apparent concern. She had no obvious reason to expect that this particular meeting would be different from the carefully managed surface-level exchanges that she and Anne had navigated for years. Polite, controlled, neither warm nor openly hostile. The kind of interaction that functions because both parties have agreed, without ever saying so, to keep things within certain boundaries. That agreement did not survive the first few minutes of what followed. Anne came with a folder. This detail, small as it sounds, carried enormous significance to anyone who understood how she operated. She did not come with talking points or a general sense of grievance. She came with documentation, specific, factual, administrative documentation that laid out, in the kind of clear and unarguable terms that palace records generate when you know how to read them. Exactly what had been arranged, by whom, on whose authority, and through which channels. The access to the private section of the late Queen's wardrobe archive. The internal coordination between offices. The partial notification given to the Royal Collection Trust that had not fully described what was being proposed. The names of the staff members who had been involved in making the arrangements. It was all there, set out methodically, the way Anne set everything out when she had decided that something needed to be addressed. Camilla's initial response, according to those who were later made aware of how the conversation unfolded, was the one she typically defaulted to when faced with an uncomfortable challenge. She was composed, she offered context, she explained the thinking behind the decision in terms that framed it as a considered, even generous act, a carefully placed gesture designed to help rebuild something that had been broken in service of a broader goal that the whole family presumably shared. She spoke about King Charles's health and his desire to find some form of peace with his son before time ran out for that possibility. She positioned the decision as part of something larger and more important than any single question of protocol or hierarchy. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge that this framing was not entirely without foundation. King Charles had indeed been dealing with a serious health situation. He had met with Harry privately. There was genuine movement, however tentative, towards something that might eventually resemble reconciliation. And Camilla, whatever her critics said about her methods, had over the years demonstrated a real understanding of how to use quiet, symbolic gestures to shift the emotional temperature of a situation without forcing a direct confrontation. It was a skill she had developed over decades of navigating extraordinarily difficult circumstances, and it had served her well. But Anne was not moved by the framing, and this is where the conversation reportedly changed in a way that Camilla had not anticipated. Anne did not dispute Charles's desire for reconciliation. She did not argue against the principle of the family finding some way through the damage of the past several years. What she said, calmly and with the kind of precision that made it clear she had thought this through from every angle before walking into the room, was that the late Queen's private wardrobe was not a resource available for that purpose. It was not a diplomatic instrument. It was not something that could be repurposed, however well-intentioned the repurposing, into a gesture of goodwill towards someone who had chosen, on multiple occasions and very publicly, to place their own interests above the interests of the institution that wardrobe represented. She spoke about her mother, not in a sentimental way, not in the way that might have allowed Camilla to respond with equal sentiment and redirect the conversation towards softer ground. She spoke about her mother the way she spoke about duty, factually, directly, and with a clarity that left very little room for interpretation. Queen Elizabeth II had spent her entire life maintaining a boundary between what was personal and what belonged to the crown. She had never exploited that boundary for her own benefit. She had never used her personal feelings about individuals, and she had had strong feelings about a great many situations over 70 years, to influence decisions that should have been made on the basis of what was right for the institution. The private pieces of her wardrobe sat on the personal side of that boundary. They were not the crown's to give away, and they were certainly not Camilla's to offer. There was, by this point in the conversation, a quality to the room that several people connected to both offices later described in remarkably similar terms. Still, charged. The kind of atmosphere in which people become very aware of where they are standing and whether they are in the right place. Camilla, to her credit, did not immediately fold. She pushed back. She suggested that Anne was viewing the situation through a lens that was perhaps influenced by personal feelings about the Sussexes, rather than by a genuinely principled concern about protocol. This was a calculated move. It invited Anne to defend herself emotionally, which would have shifted the ground of the argument away from documentation and toward feeling, territory that Camilla, with her considerable experience in managing difficult interpersonal dynamics, was far more comfortable operating in. Anne did not take the invitation. She acknowledged, briefly and without elaboration, that her personal views about the Duchess of Sussex were well known to anyone paying attention. She then returned, without raising her voice or changing her expression in any way that anyone present would later describe as visibly angry, to the specific and documentable facts in front of them. The access had been arranged without proper authorization. The Royal Collection Trust had not been fully informed. The standard channels had been bypassed. these were not matters of personal feeling. They were matters of institutional process. An institutional process existed precisely to prevent the kind of decision-making that substituted one person's judgment about what was appropriate for the collective framework that was supposed to govern these things. It was at this point that she stood up. She gathered the folder from the surface in front of her. She did this carefully, without any theatrical emphasis, in the same way that she did everything, efficiently and without waste. She looked across at Camilla with an expression that those familiar with Princess Anne would have immediately recognized as the end of a conversation, rather than the beginning of a pause in one. And then she walked out. Not quickly, not with the kind of charged, visible emotion that the word storming implies, but with a deliberateness that communicated, to everyone in the vicinity who registered it, that what had just happened was not a temporary breakdown in communication that could be smoothed over with a phone call or a diplomatic note from one office to the other. It was a line being drawn, a statement made not in words, but in the act of leaving a room and not looking back. Staff in the corridor outside, junior members who had no knowledge of what the meeting had contained, later described noticing something in the few seconds after she emerged. She walked at her usual pace. Her face was composed, but there was something in the set of her shoulders and the direction of her gaze that made at least one of them step aside without being asked, in the instinctive way that people move when they sense that the person coming toward them is carrying something serious and has no interest in being delayed. Camilla remained in the room. Those who saw her in the minutes and hours that followed noted that her usual composure was intact. She was too practiced for anything else. But there were small signs, visible to those who knew what to look for, that the conversation had landed harder than she had expected. A quietness in her office that afternoon, a canceled informal engagement that had been on the afternoon schedule, a message sent to a senior aide that, while entirely ordinary in its phrasing, suggested that certain arrangements were now under internal review. Because whatever Camilla had thought of this meeting was going to be when she agreed to it, she now understood what it actually was. It was not a complaint. It was not an appeal. It was not a request for things to be handled differently in the future. It was Princess Anne, telling her, in the clearest language she knew how to use, that she had gone somewhere she should not have gone, that the evidence was documented, and that the matter was not finished. The room had been left, but the folder had not been put away. And in the world of the British royal family, where so much depends on what people know and what they are prepared to do with what they know, that distinction meant everything. King Charles III has never found it easy to be caught between the people he loves. It is, by most accounts, one of the defining tensions of his life. A man of deep personal loyalty who has spent decades watching the relationships around him fracture under pressures that a royal existence generates, in ways that ordinary family life simply does not. He lost his first marriage in circumstances that became one of the most publicly dissected royal stories of the 20th century. He watched his younger son leave the country and then, from 3,000 miles away, described the royal family in terms that caused pain to almost everyone inside it. He has been dealing, more recently, with a serious health situation that has reminded everyone around him, including himself, that time is not an unlimited resource. Against all of that, his desire to find some form of peace before more time passes is not difficult to understand. It is, in many ways, deeply human, but Charles is also a king, and the job of being a king, the actual day-to-day institutional reality of it, requires a different kind of thinking than the personal kind. It requires the ability to separate what you want from what the position demands. This is precisely what his mother did for 70 years, with a consistency that astonished even those closest to her. It is what Princess Anne has done throughout her entire royal life. And it is what Charles, in the weeks that followed the confrontation between his sister and his wife, was now being quietly but unmistakably asked to do again. Anne did not go to him immediately after leaving the room. That would not have been her way. She gave it time, not a long time, but enough time to allow the fact of the meeting and its outcome to settle into the palace's internal atmosphere, which it did in the way that significant things always do inside institutions where people are paid close attention to the movements and moods of those at the top. Camilla's office was quieter. Certain arrangements were paused. The particular kind of alert stillness that precedes a formal reckoning descended over the relevant corridors, and those experienced enough to recognize it understood that something was coming. When Anne did speak to Charles, the conversation was private. Whatever passed between them in that meeting belongs to the category of things that the royal family manages to keep genuinely contained, which is a smaller category than most people realize, but a real one nonetheless. What became apparent in the days that followed, through the observable changes in how certain things were being handled, told its own story without any need for direct disclosure. Anne's approach to Charles would not have been an emotional appeal. She would not have framed it as a grievance about Camilla, or used the language of personal hurt, because she knew that this would allow the response to be framed in terms of managing a family disagreement, rather than addressing an institutional failure. Instead, she would have done what she always did. She would have brought the facts. The documentation, the specific demonstrable record of what had been arranged, how it had been arranged, and what had been bypassed in the process. She would have let the facts make the case, because facts, in her experience, were considerably more durable than feelings when it came to producing actual change. Charles, by all accounts, takes the institutional integrity of the monarchy seriously. This is sometimes obscured by the more personal and emotional aspects of his story, but it is real. He has spent years preparing for a role that he understood from childhood would require placing the crown above his own preferences. He has, at various points in his life, done that at considerable personal cost. And when the facts of what had been arranged, the bypassed channels, the partial notification to the Royal Collection Trust, the access granted to pieces from his mother's private archive without the authorization that such access should have required, were laid out in front of him, the response was not one that could reasonably be described as ambiguous. The changes that followed were implemented quietly. There was no formal announcement, no press statement, no public acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong or been corrected. The royal family does not, as a general rule, confirm the details of its internal disputes to the outside world, and this situation was handled in exactly that tradition. But the changes were real, and they were visible to anyone positioned closely enough to the relevant offices to observe them. The access arrangement for the Duchess of Sussex to view pieces from the private section of the late Queen's wardrobe archive was reversed. It did not happen. The partial notification that had been given to the Royal Collection Trust was followed up with a more complete account of what had been proposed, and the Trust's curatorial committee was brought back into the process in the way it should have been from the beginning. The internal coordination that had been handled between offices without going through the standard channels was reviewed, and the staff members who had been involved were made aware, through the measured but unambiguous language that institutions use when they want to correct behavior without creating a formal disciplinary record, that the process had not been followed correctly. Camilla retained, of course, everything that came with her position, her title, her role in public life, her place beside Charles at every official occasion. None of that changed, and it was never going to. The monarchy does not resolve its internal tensions by removing people from positions they constitutionally hold, and Anne had never been seeking that outcome. What she had been seeking was more specific and, in its own way, more meaningful than any formal consequence could have been. She had been seeking acknowledgement, not the public kind, not the kind that required anyone to say out loud that a mistake had been made and who had made it. The internal kind. The kind where an institution looks at what happened, identifies where it went wrong, and puts in place the corrections that make it less likely to go wrong in the same way again. This is a quieter form of justice than most people find satisfying when they read about it. But within the specific world of the British royal family, where almost everything of real consequence happens below the surface and without public confirmation, it is often the most that can be achieved. And it is, arguably, the most that lasts. Princess Anne's position within the palace, in the weeks and months that followed, carried a different quality than it had before, not louder, not more prominent in any outward sense. She continued her schedule with exactly the same consistency she had always brought to it, fulfilling engagements, representing the crown, doing the work without seeking attention for the doing of it. But there was a recognition among those inside the institution, among the staff, the advisors, the quiet operational layer of people who keep the royal household functioning from one day to the next, that she had done something significant. She had identified a boundary. She had documented where it had been crossed. She had taken the matter to the person with the authority to address it, and she had done all of this without a single public word, without a leak to any journalist, and without allowing herself to be drawn into the kind of visible conflict that would have damaged the institution she was trying to protect. This is, in many ways, exactly what her mother would have done. Queen Elizabeth II was not a woman who resolved problems by making them visible. She resolved them by being absolutely clear in private about where she stood, and then trusting the people around her to respond accordingly. Anne had inherited this quality more fully than any of her siblings, and it showed in the way this situation had been handled from the moment she first learned, by accident in a palace corridor, that something had been done that should not have been done. The question of Sussex reconciliation did not disappear. It continues to exist as one of the more complicated ongoing realities of the current royal family's situation. Charles still appears to want some form of connection with his son. Harry has expressed, at various points, a desire for things to be better than they are. Whether any of that eventually translates into something concrete remains genuinely uncertain, and the people closest to the situation seem to disagree about how likely it is and what form it might take. But what this episode established, clearly enough that no one inside the palace could reasonably claim not to have understood it, was that the path toward any reconciliation could not run through the late Queen's personal legacy. That particular route was closed. Anne had closed it, and unlike many things in the world of royal politics, that closure appeared to be the kind that held. There is a detail that those who know Princess Anne tend to mention when they talk about what distinguishes her from almost every other senior member of the royal family. It is not her work ethic, though that is extraordinary. It is not her directness, though that is real and often startling to people who encounter it for the first time. It is the fact that she has never, in more than 50 years of public life, appeared to be doing any of it for recognition. She does not need to be seen to be winning in order to keep going. She does not require the external validation of a public narrative that confirms she was right. She knows what she did and why she did it, and that appears genuinely to be sufficient. In the days after the situation had been resolved, she was seen walking the long corridors of the palace on her way between engagements, carrying the same expression she always carried: focused, forward-looking, entirely present in whatever she was moving toward rather than whatever she had left behind. A member of staff who passed her in one of those corridors and offered a quiet good morning received, by all accounts, exactly the same response she would have received on any other ordinary day: composed, warm in its own restrained way, completely without drama. Outside, London carried on. The exhibition honoring Queen Elizabeth's life and style was drawing visitors from across the world. The late Queen's coronation gown stood behind glass. Her wedding dress, her riding jackets and headscarves, and the clear raincoat were designed so that crowds could always see the color she was wearing regardless of the weather. A life of duty, preserved and presented for the public to walk through and understand a little better. Inside the palace, another kind of preservation had taken place, quieter, less visible, but to those who understood what it meant, no less important.